we get started, I want to say a couple of things about next week, because you all know Monday's a holiday. So the next time we're going to get together is going to be the Wednesday when the display is supposed to be up. So I want to be clear about that. I'll come in before Wednesday and have the panel set up in the South Atrium. So Wednesday morning, you should plan on putting your stuff up. We'll meet in class Wednesday and Friday. Because Monday's a holiday, you and Ian will present your progress reports on Wednesday to the class. I'll do a chalk talk Friday, and then after that, all the progress reports are over because we're in the chute with the formal PowerPoints and Dean's conference room. And we'll have some time after this weekend during next week, particularly next Friday, when I've got the class, to make sure we're clear out the PowerPoints and how it's going to work. But the main thing I want to say is, because we're not going to meet again until the day that displays go up, that we're all clear on that. Any questions about the displays at all? Hopefully we've said enough about that to be clear. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just putting up basically what we have to this point up on.
Exactly. And I'll have 3 panels per student, which I'm hearing from you guys is going to be enough space.
It's not reading money.
I think that's really all I need to say. Any other clarifications there?
This is supposed to be posters plus written work.
Posters and
And written
These
work.
are exactly wrong.
anything and everything you've got. Nothing still in the, any piece you've made, whether it's process or final, it should go up. Look at your notes. Okay, today Inatz is our guest, who's here to talk about his ideas about the thesis.
Is that on set?
What?
Your laptop was set?
There's a message missing.
The camera's on?
How do I get the Zoom? There's the message on. Okay.
You got the
So, and he's our last thesis chair, who's going to be coming in, so we will have heard from all of them today. I've personally enjoyed the variation and different takes on the thesis, so
It's on.
we're eager to hear what you've got to tell us today. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm not getting it. Okay, as most of you know, I've got a cold and we already talked, but I'm going to try and power through this. If you have any questions, just speak up. When Tim asked me if I'd come in, I kind of weighed what I would talk about. And I had several options, and one option was to just present my thesis when I was a student. And so that's what I decided to do, and it's kind of a bit of a what not to do story. So I hope you can learn from what I went through and not repeat some of that. The big problem I had was that I was a very serious student. I mean, I was a strange cat that when I was in high school, I set a goal of reading 100 books one year that were considered the top 100 books. And so when I was faced with this idea of what to write a thesis on, I kind of took on the whole world. And I can show you sort of what that means in a minute. But this is, and you'll see I keep everything. This was my first statement of what my intent was for my thesis back in November the 1st of 1978. 71. And you'll see I started out thinking that I was going to do something that had to do with programming and something that had to do with understanding how organizations operate, particularly large bureaucratic organizations. And so that was my starting point. Then 3 days later, I submitted this as a more complete proposal for my thesis. And I was very interested at the time in something called the systems approach. The systems approach in the late 60s was all the rage. Everybody was looking at. And it had to do with the space program. It had to do with Operation Breakthrough, which was a big program trying to solve the housing crisis. And so I was looking at how can the systems approach be applied to planning and design of government facilities. I was working in the government at the time, part-time, and so I had access to a lot of information. A lot of things had to do with that. And so you can see the areas of research included operational research that had to do with different kinds of modeling, probability theory, evaluation theory, statistical decision theory, things like that that had to do with sort of the mathematics of planning. And I also was interested in certain buildings, certain icons, certain examples, which probably are not that familiar to you, like Tufts New England Medical Center, which was designed in a way that I really could relate to, Northwood Park Hospital, and the Yamakashi Communications Tower by Kenzo Kage. So these were some of my inspirations. I was also interested in how government worked because I was in government. So I wanted to study what their procedures were and how they went about planning new facilities and how they brought new facilities on board and how office buildings were designed in particular. And how programming was a major part of that and what role programming could play in the design of that architecture. And the areas of analysis that I included were urban design analysis and analysis of the special typology that was the office spaces that I was interested in. And so that was like my outline proposal. Here's the table of contents for the actual thesis. And you'll see that part A, conceptual framework. Now this is what I highly recommend you not do. Because what I did was I literally took on the whole world and I tried to investigate how our view of the world, how our particular paradigm about the world has evolved from the beginning to now. Now being 1969. And how that worldview influences the way we think about architecture and think about design. And then another chapter, I looked at the behavior of organizations versus the behavior of buildings. And it was kind of an odd thing to think about buildings as having behavior, but that was what I was interested in. And then part B of the thesis looked at strategies and tactics and how we can progress through a design exercise that results in buildings that are consistent with the worldview that I had uncovered. And then I took on a case study. The case study was the government of Manitoba. And so what I did was I traced the whole history of the government of Manitoba from the very beginning until the present at that time. And I mapped all of the buildings. I mapped the growth of each department. And I looked at how historically had grown, and I thought about how I should plan the next sort of round of growth. And then I took one of the buildings in that master plan that I developed and designed it as an architectural project. So if you look at that little, you can't probably see it very well, but if you look at that little cartoon at the top, that was my initial inspiration. I started thinking about the fact that increasingly buildings were being demolished that were perfectly good buildings in terms of their structure, their material that had been invested in them. And there was this premature obsolescence that was occurring. And so I thought, how can we get around that? It seemed kind of a waste of money and a waste of energy. So what I began to think was that it's happening because we don't design buildings to last. We design buildings without a conscious awareness of time and how, over time, buildings need to respond and how they need to behave to be successful over time. And when I mentioned this to the faculty that were guiding me, they looked at me very quizzically, like, architecture is about space, not about time. And they weren't quite sure what I was getting at. Because in sort of the height of modernist dogma in the 1960s, it was all about form and modern architecture and material and minimalist design and so on. This was one of the diagrams that I developed to kind of make the argument as to why it was important to pay attention to how buildings perform over their lifespan, and not simply the day they're opened and the day they take pictures to put in magazines. And in this case, this was looking at a particular period of time that had to do with the government of Manitoba from the Second World War to 1962, and how the lifespan of buildings prior to the Second World War was greater. And it was greater partly because of technology and partly because we weren't so hung up on efficiency. Many buildings that were built, and I traced this when I looked at conceptual framework. I looked at what was sort of the Greek and Roman idea about space and performance and programming, and how that related to whether those buildings could perform for a very long time, which they have, because they weren't so tailor-made for a particular activity. They were all more about the appearance of the building and the front facade and so on. So what's happening is that as technological change accelerates, the physical deterioration of the buildings has not really declined, except that we're not using as much stone and masonry construction and so on. So there is some decline in the physical deterioration of buildings, which could be called their natural lifespan. But the actual lifespan of the buildings has become dramatically shorter because they've become out of date. There are newer and better technologies. It's like cars. A car today is vastly different than cars 6-7 years ago with all the technology. But the other thing that's happened is organizations have become much more aware of efficient use of their space. So if they grow and they can't fit in the building properly, they're more likely to abandon the building. So, we have this problem, and this again was in the 60s mostly, of accelerating growth and change rates within everything in society. The 60s was this interesting time where a lot of change was occurring. So, as I said, that wasn't as big a problem in the past. That had become more and more of a problem, and I think it's still a big problem. So this whole chapter on the development of worldview as it affects architecture is one that I spent at least 6 months on, and I have all the research right here. We didn't have computers. All I could do was go to a library, check out a book, and go through the book and make notes. And that's what this is. This is my notes from researching that. And there's some crazy stuff in here. I got into statistics into mathematical modeling. I got into a lot of different disciplines. And I didn't get very good guidance. I should have had someone reel me back at the time. Say, wait a minute, you can't go there because it's only vaguely related to your topic. So here I trace, what the Greeks thought about the world as static and things were not really changeable. The Aristotelian concept of space, and then what happened when sort of we moved into rationalism and René Descartes, and how that changed the world, and the whole idea of the mechanistic worldview that evolved, and how science was seen as the cure-all. Science was the most important thing. And so, as it says here, the first half of the 20th century saw classical determinism of the 19th century replaced by a sort of actuarial law of physics. Physics and mathematics became sort of the thing that we worshipped in the 20th century, certainly in the first half of the 20th century. And so this kind of static worldview was being replaced by a very dynamic conception of the world. And but we were still thinking of architecture in very static terms. Buildings were static. The whole notion was that architecture was not part of this whole trend towards things being process-oriented and dynamic. So I did find a few sources where people were talking about what I was interested in. And now there's been quite a bit written about this in the past 10, 20 years. At the time, when I was writing this, I did feel kind of alone in doing this because it was not something we had even mentioned anywhere in school. And it was something I had kind of, on my own, started to think, well, wait a minute, why are we not talking about this? And one of my inspirations was my long-standing interest in sort of Zen and Buddhism, and sort of Eastern consciousness and their way of thinking about the world, and where reality is understood as being a state of perpetual becoming. And I thought, well, maybe that is a concept for architecture in this new world of constant change and dynamic sort of processes. And so I also started to look at biology as one of the disciplines that I investigated. And what can we learn from biology that should inform architecture? And so, as this quote says here, a living thing is not a fixed thing, but a flowing event, like a flame or a whirlpool. The shape alone is stable, and the substance is a stream of energy going in at one end and out the other. And I thought, well, what if that was a model for architecture? One of the big investigations I went into, and one of the bulk of this material here, has to do with organizational theory, cybernetics, and information studies that were also of interest to people at the time. And so I was looking at, what if we apply this sort of biological model to human organizations? Can we do that? Does it make sense? And so I looked at the evolution of human organizations over history, and the fact that they had started out as autocratic, and then they became more bureaucratic, and eventually decentralized. And the current sort of cutting-edge mode of organizing was through an adhocracy, where organizations were set up for shorter periods of time, on a need to know based, on need to do something based, task oriented, and more dynamic. And how do we design architecture for that type of organization, that type of user group? And so my basic idea was that we need to understand how these organizations behave over time, how they grow, how they change, in order to be able to fit a building around that organization that is sensitive to and responsive to that organization. But first we had to understand how organizations develop over time. So this is some of the text, and I'm not going to get into that, but one of the things I looked at was general systems theory. And general systems theory looked at how organizations change. And there were things like the principle of increasingly unfavorable internal structure. And there's the principle of increasingly unfavorable external structure. And so as an organism, once it's born, the theory is that over time, the environment of that organization becomes more and more unfavorable to the organism. And there was a particular book called General Systems Theory by Bertrand Ludwig Bernoulli that I used quite a bit in there. I also looked at Darcy Thompson and some of the other people who were writing about biological growth and change, and within this sort of whole arena. So this is a summary of my first part of the thesis. What time was this concept? 19. And so these were my conclusions, my guiding principles that came out of the research. All reality is dynamic rather than static. The world, as we understand it, is organized, consists of levels of interrelated processes or systems. All existence occurs within the space-time continuum rather than separate space and separate time. And this was based on my studies of physics, and particularly Einstein and so on. Our heritage of past notions of reality, plus our inheritance of social institutions and values, prevents us from fully comprehending the present. So we're so conditioned by what we already know and what we've experienced that in the past that really truly being present is difficult. The future cannot be completely determined. We can only predict with certainty the mean behavior of a large number of identical events. There's a famous statement that we can predict where the bomb will land, but we can't predict where all the shrapnel is going to fly, or all the pieces are going to go. And this whole notion of predicting and futures and trying to determine what's going to happen in the future was another area that I got really involved in. And I read a lot of philosophy on that, which had to do with what is the future and how do we predict the future. And there were some interesting points of view there, like it's a mistake to do a straight line projection from the past into the future, because any catastrophic event will totally alter the future, and so on. So you can't really count on what the future is going to be like. It's not an extension of the present.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So every chapter you in your thesis you'll do a sum, or is it just basically extracting what you've learned from your research and that's
No, this is kind of a summary of the other parts of it, which I did in the first two parts. The first part being this kind of research, the second part being more into the architecture, and then the actual design of the buildings. I didn't have a summary of that. So anyway, there's a bunch of these all the way down to number 19. The number 19 is the problem of planning resources for social organizations is indeterminate. I was interested a lot in probability theory and things like that. So as I started to get into, that was the end of that section. So I started to get more into the architectural implications of this way of thinking. And one of the first things I did, I looked at how what buildings are really consist of. And I looked at what if buildings were componentized, and we looked at the differential obsolescence of all the different components and all the different parts. The logic being that if you design it correctly, the building can be kept up to date fairly easily and inexpensively, as long as you don't build in the stuff that has to change in such a way that it causes a lot of demolition, a lot of other costs. And so this shows a scale of what things are fairly permanent and what things are fairly short-term. So at the bottom, it's partitions and furnishings can be rearranged and renovation can occur very easily. Then the one above that, ceilings and so on, all the way up to entry and stairwells and structure being the most permanent. Now that may not even be necessarily true. I can imagine a situation where one designs structure in such a way that it can be modified in its lifespan. But this was an important notion that had a lot to do with my design solution. Then I looked at the difference between something that I call developmental planning and design and ongoing planning and design. The distinction being that the developmental planning and design had to do with getting the building started, getting it up and running, and then the ongoing planning and design had to do with maintaining the building at a high level of effectiveness over its lifespan. And both of those I saw as a design problem, a design issue. So if we were to look at the different models for how one does planning, both at a strategic and tactical level, there's what I consider the ideal approach, which is continuous planning, where you don't really stop planning. You make very smooth changes in relationship to what it is that's being planned. And that requires independent, unique buildings that aren't all under one roof. And it might even include temporary disposable buildings, all kinds of techniques for being able to make adjustments very easily and smoothly. The second, probably more realistic approach is incremental planning, where you have an infrastructure that is indeterminate, and you have long-term adaptable buildings. They might be larger buildings. And one important idea is that within those buildings, you have something I call multi-strategic spaces. And those multi-strategic spaces are things that have a certain amount of flex, so that you can have a range of things occurring in those spaces without having to alter the space or tear it down. And the least effective approach over time is to master plan. When you master plan, you set things in stone, and usually at the time you're doing it, it's quite a bit earlier than the master plan is really implemented, and so you're kind of stuck with something that is not flexible enough. And this was one of my pet peeves at the time. I kept seeing people doing master plans, like they do a 10-year master plan, 20-year master plan. They say this building is going to go here in 10 years, this building is going to go here in 20 years. And I thought, that's crazy. You don't know that. Every master plan changes constantly. And here's sort of a diagram that I did that looks at that the difference between master planning and incremental planning. I guess incremental planning is a type of master planning. But when you're doing incremental planning, you have greater flexibility to make mid-course corrections, so that when you find that the world around you has changed, you basically change your plan. You don't feel obligated to stick to it. Then I looked at some examples of architecture that began to address the notions that I was interested in, like archigram. And archigram at the time was one of the architectural movements that I was fascinated by. And this is Peter Cook, who's still practicing architecture today, and in his 90s. I just listened to a lecture by him the other day. And his componentized, plug-in type of. Now, why I think this is a response to incremental, short-term incremental planning and time is that this is not an organism that was built all at once. This is something that grows over time. And you can see the parts don't have to resemble each other. They can be whatever is required. So there's an indeterminacy here that I thought made sense. Lou Kahn's Richard Medical Research Building, on the other hand, had some of the ideas that I was playing with about pulling all of the services to the exterior so that they can easily be modified without disturbing the interior. The part about small incremental pieces that are added rather than one big, large chunk. But it does disappoint me in that those square building components are all identical. It seemed to me that they should be different. That was the sort of formalism that he fell into that I think, it's nice and tidy, but I think it kind of lost. This was another important movement or idea that I was looking at. Mies van der Rohe had this idea about space and time and how one needs to design buildings that are fairly universal spaces within which all kinds of things can happen. So it's sort of like the big barn approach or the black box approach where it's non-specific. That could be Crown Hall in Chicago. It could be the art gallery in Berlin, and so on, which are the same building. So this was my notion, and I'm not showing you most, the document itself was, this thick document. I'm going to show you the diagrams and stuff. So this was a diagram I developed that looked at this whole notion about architecture being a continuous process rather than a one-time shot. And so there's this idea of initial planning, ongoing planning, and it's cyclical, so that you go through analysis, briefing, which is programming, adapting, monitoring performance, evaluating, then creating a synthesis for the new initial planning and so on. So this keeps going until the building has to be demolished. The other sort of study that I looked at was how should buildings grow, or how could they grow in order to be fit in this idea of buildings successfully living up their life. And I had many more of these. I only threw in a couple here, where you just build unique multi-story buildings next to each other and you link them so that there's no obligation for the buildings to be similar or to relate. And it's that tendency to want them to be similar or identical and to relate that gets in the way. Because if one is built later, then you really want to make it the best building at that moment and not hamstrung by something that was done in the past. So it's indeterminate growth. You make that building whatever it needs to be. The core elements, which maybe are shared, they can be updated because they're on the outside and so on. The second approach down below, or it's actually the same approach shown in a different view, but there is a disadvantage that the external core, and this is in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is cold in Siberia. The external core does create some problems with temperature, heat loss, and so on. These are some of the other approaches where you have a prototypical building and you just multiply it You just repeat the same building over and over again. And yeah, you could save something in terms of design time because you're just rubber stamping the same building, but there's serious disadvantages to that approach because you're kind of committed to a building that maybe didn't even work all that well and certainly is not appropriate for that moment in time that you're putting the building. I also looked at how within a building departments move around. This was part of the study of organizations and how organizations behave over time and their relationship to buildings. And so let's just look at how growth can occur in different ways. So summary of part B that I've just gone through. Planning tactics should acknowledge the presence of growth and change in space-time by not unnecessarily restricting the nature and substance of future increments. So that's saying that, it can be indeterminate. Generally, prototypical solutions or rigid physical infrastructure should be avoided in favor of indeterminate assemblages. With any planning tactic, the initial planning of a particular increment should be attempting to generate buildings which are updatable. So whatever you're building should be updatable. Differential obsolescence of building components should be acknowledged through componentization of the building. And components should be identified according to compatibility of function, obsolescence, characteristics. So there's three types of space that I identified. Multi-strategic space, which I already described a little bit. Specific space with a temporary function, and specific space with a permanent function. And those spaces would be handled differently in their design. A big part of what I did as well was I researched the evolution of the government of Manitoba, both the space and the organizations. And so this looks at the office space demand over from 1970 to what was a projection in 1978. And the idea being that this kind of incremental growth and supply and demand required small incremental growth of smaller components of buildings rather than one mega building. Because the idea was that if you build one mega building, you have to overbuild it, and it's very inefficient, and then eventually it'll be filled up, and then you build another giant building. So I studied one building in particular and how it has changed in its patterns and how the organizations were using the building, 1960 versus 1970. And then I postulated that a great deal of the relationship between the tenant groups and how the tenant groups behaved had to do with the location of the core and how that was organized. So then the design application was centered around that particular city block that you see on the right. What you can see on the left are some of my design sketching, and that's the way I do design. I just do sketch on top of sketch on top of sketch. I combine sections with plan and elevation and words and whatever I feel like I need to express. And I don't really care what it looks like. And on the right is a diagram that shows the kind of the planning level of what I was proposing to do with the design of buildings that I was going to be doing. So that was, and unfortunately, I don't have the drawings. This is sort of the only thing I don't have. Are the drawings of the project the actual design part of the project. They were kept by the universities and the model. And none of it was digital, so I don't have any record. I can tell you though, the building was pretty simple. It was basically the one building, the main building, was the one that turned the corner, and it had a skin a panel, it was panelized skin where the panels could be changed. The core was external, and it was divided, I think, into 3 cores. Each one had a different lifespan, each one had a different function. The stairs and elevators were permanent, considered to be permanent. It was actually, in the end, it was not very exciting architecture, but I was trying to be true to what I was trying to do. And the other buildings that were planned in the future, logically, I couldn't design those buildings because they were in the future. And if I was following through, I would say, that's something I can't design because we're not in that time, and we don't know what the particulars are at that point in time that building is going to be designed. So I didn't design it as a set piece of 3 buildings. I simply designed one building and said, here's where the other ones could go, but nothing beyond that. So there was not a heavy design aspect to my thesis. It was mostly, I would say the heavy part was the investigation of conceptual frameworks throughout history and the way people think and what the relationship between science and the art and those big questions that I would not recommend that you guys begin to dig into, because it's a never-ending thing. Who's having
Still got 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, you guys have any questions? Anything you want me
Yeah,
to-
let's see who's got questions.
If you were to take on a thesis like this, say today,
Yeah.
that you say that you recommend I would do that, what pieces would you cut out to smooth down?
I would not feel compelled to have to prove that it was important to consider time in architecture. At the time when I did this, it was important to make the argument because it wasn't in the consciousness of people in architecture. It just didn't think in those terms. So I wouldn't feel like I had to do that, which would cut out a fair amount of work that I did. I mean, I can pass this around. I mean, this is the real rough stuff. I mean, this is all the. And I did work disorganized. I did have this, I didn't have little scraps of paper here and there. I used this as my record of what I was researching.
I think your question gets at the issue of, for you guys, you've got your thesis topic or topics in your application. And there's always a judgment call about how deeply you perform scholarship on your topic. How many books do you read? How familiar do you get with the landscape of the theoretical structures there? And what you see in N's project, he not only did that, but then he researched the context of that, and then the context of that. And so, as he's saying, that's a never-ending process, because eventually, you're going to get into very non-architectural kinds of topics, which he thrived on and
Yeah.
enjoyed looking at.
I mean, I love that stuff, but it was getting in the way. Being able to finish. I actually finished, in my graduating class, one person finished on time, out of 8, and that wasn't me. I finished in the summer. I should have finished at the end of the spring, and I finished in the summer.
I've got, I guess, a question / observation. I can imagine that this kind of investigation, flex, change, churn, all that kind of stuff, is what generated open office landscape as a fundamental strategy of handling this fluidity that we're talking about.
Right, yeah. The whole idea of designing in an indeterminate manner is difficult because it's sort of anti-design. We think of design as control. And if you let go of that control and you say, we're going to, we don't know how it's going to turn out, we're just setting something in motion, then, some people are not that comfortable with this designing.
I can remember, this school used to have a relationship with some big corporations, one of them was IBM. And I can remember the guy we were working with, saying, he said, here's an instance of what you're talking about. We've done this business plan, and by next year, we have to have 50,000 square feet totally done in Scotland, but we don't know what's going to be in it yet. In other words, there were these forces coming in that caused them to have to move on the building, but the other forces hadn't caught up with it yet and couldn't catch up with it. And so it's the same kind of dilemma that you're talking about. You got to move here, but you don't really know yet everything you need to know. So what do you do there? So they had to analyze all the things that were likely and design a building that would receive most of them gracefully.
Right. And when I went from this and graduated and worked in offices, I tried to bring some of that into the office. And the difficulty is with clients. They don't want to hear that you're not designing something really tailor-made to them, because that's what they think they're paying you for. And when you talk about life cycle considerations, unless it's something where they're going to own the building for the whole life cycle, they really just care about the initial return on the investment. If it's a developer, for example, they have a different mindset. But in this day and age, we have gotten back to some of the concerns that we had, and I'm sure Tim remembers this, where in the 70s and 60s, passive design, environment, designing with the environment was a really big deal. We were out to save the earth. You know, we have this slogan that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And architecture was seen in many places as the problem, because buildings were, particularly modernist buildings, these anonymous sort of glass and steel boxes, were not particularly sensitive to the environment, and so there was this kind of counterculture in architecture that was kind of dismissed at some point as a bunch of hippies. But that was also informing my thinking in this process.
The other thing I noticed about your thesis here, and I'm almost imagining it like an hourglass, you know, the top part's your research, and you took it in the broader and broader realms of looking at it. And then you went through the aperture to the application, and you also went more deeply than normal or typically into, let's say, the physical implications for how the building should be delivered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your description is a clear one about how you went about it, what was unusual about it.
And you know, 40 years later, I still believe in this stuff. So that's interesting.
It's a lot of it held up. Probably more true today than ever.
It was not well received at the school. I didn't get a pat on the back or anything. So. I guess we have to graduate this guy.
You were on my own.
This strange guy. Because, yeah, my classmates were doing things like, you know, Villa and Italy, and some of them did more socially conscious things like housing development for the Inuit in northern Manitoba. Stuff like that. They were doing, you know, what I would consider mainstream projects. One student did an interesting paper, which I really admired, on the phenomenology of blue collar. You know, and he went on to be a faculty member somewhere. And, John Patkow, who has won many, many awards and is pretty well known around the world as a good designer, he was in my class. He did a hospital. Just his own hospital, his thesis.
Did you remember whether most theses back then had a scholarly topic informing them, or was it enough to design,
It was mostly a design.
just
Mostly
design the latest, greatest hospital?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, appreciate your coming in, thanks.
Yeah, I tried.
See you all on Wednesday.
Sorry I didn't feel so good.
You got it?
I had a bubble too.
Good.